Okay. Yeah. Now it's fine. Yes.
Is it okay?
Perfect. Yeah. Now it's perfect, actually. Okay. Okay. Good morning once again, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to our plenary session of the convention. This is one of the special sessions which we organized because Mr. Parmeshwar Iyer from Delhi has kindly agreed to speak to us. I know you were not able to travel from Delhi. Would have loved to have him in person. And he's talking to us on a subject which is very, very widely discussed today. Azadi Amrit Kaal, India at 100. And nobody could be better than Mr. Parmeshwar Iyer to speak to us. You all know Mr. Parmeshwar Iyer is the CEO of Niti Aayog at the moment, and he's moving to World Bank shortly. And may I have the AV of Mr. Parmeshwar Iyer, please?
Mr. Parameshwaran Iyer is the Chief Executive Officer of Niti Aayog. With an illustrious career spanning over 4 decades, Mr. Iyer worked in various capacities with both the government and the World Bank. During 2016-20, he served as the Secretary to the Government of India in the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation and led the implementation of India's flagship $20 billion Swachh Bharat mission, which delivered access to safe sanitation to 550 million people. He led the innovative community-led Swajal project in Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand in the 1990s. The Swajal project became one of the world's leading rural water projects, pioneering decentralized service delivery, and key lessons were scaled up at the national level in India.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my proud privilege to present to you Mr. Parmeshwar Iyer, CEO Niti Aayog. Talk to us and Azadi Ka Amrit Kaal, India at 100. Over to you, Mr. Iyer. Looking forward to your thought-provoking address.
Thank you very much, Vijay, and good morning to all of you. I have to confess, though, that I handed over charge as CEO of Niti Aayog last evening. So I'm the former CEO of Niti Aayog, but looking forward to taking up my next assignment as Executive Director in the World Bank. Pleasure to be here today. And this is a very, very important topic. The Prime Minister, this is the first time that any Prime Minister has spoken about India becoming a developed country, a developed nation, a Viksit Bharat by 2047, the 100th anniversary of our independence. So what is that, the pathway, the strategy in the next 25 years? What are those building blocks which are going to take us towards that goal? I'm going to talk a little bit about that to tell you what has happened so far and how do we see the roadmap going forward. So Vijay, can I have the presentation? Can you put it up?
Yes. You tell me the next slide. You have to take him on Zoom and show one slide on one of the screens. Go ahead. Do that. Otherwise, you won't be able to tell him. You got it?
So that's the sort of the big topic today, Azadi Ka Amrit Kaal and India at 100. And so I'm going to sort of take you through how I see the scenario unfolding in keeping with the Prime Minister's vision. Can we have the next slide, please? If you can, yes. Now, again, so if you look at the Prime Minister's independence speech of 2021, where he explicitly laid out his vision of the goal of Amrit Kaal. And Amrit Kaal is, these next 25 years, is really to ascend to the new heights of prosperity. A tremendous amount of work has been done so far, but now the idea is to take it to another level. And again, in the Amrit Kaal, we're really not looking at too much of an artificial distinction between rural and urban. India is rapidly urbanizing, we know that. And in fact, by 2047, it is expected that more than 50% of the country will be in urban areas. In many ways, cities are the engines of growth, but equally important is how do you make sure that both rural and urban are growing towards prosperity. And again, the third point we want to mention is where, this is what the Prime Minister has been saying, minimum government, maximum governance. And therefore, how do we improve the quality of life? Not just ease of doing business, but ease of living. And again, the role of a government, how can it move towards a facilitator and enabler and not an implementer, which has traditionally been the role of government. And then again, how can we develop the most modern infrastructure? And when we talk of infrastructure, typically we think of physical infrastructure, but in fact, we're talking of three kinds of infrastructure at least: physical, social, which includes schools, hospitals, human capital, and the third kind of infrastructure which we talk about is digital infrastructure, where India is in many ways leading the world. So modern infrastructure is all kinds of infrastructure. Next, please. Now, as you all know, despite the global headwinds and the tough situation coming out of the COVID pandemic, the Ukraine situation, so it's a tough economic situation around the world, with supply chains being affected, food, fuel, fertilizer chains being disrupted. Despite all that, as the managing director of the IMF said, a couple of months ago, India is one of the global bright spots. If you see, we are the fastest growing large economy in the world. That's number one. And these are just some numbers we wanted to put out. Smartphone data consumer. We have more than 800 million internet and smartphone users. We are number one in terms of global fintech. We are above 80%, at least 15 to 20 points above any other country. If you look at the retail development index, we are number two. Internet users probably just behind China. Mobile manufacturers, again, it's increasing by leaps and bounds. Ecosystem is fascinating. Till 8 or 9 years ago, the startup ecosystem was pretty flat. And today we have about 90,000 startups, about 90 startups every single day. And in fact, Niti Aayog has played an important role in that with our Atal Innovation Mission. We are the third largest energy consumer in the world. And if you look at our economy in terms of purchasing power parity, PPP, we're number 3. So in many ways, we have got all the ingredients of becoming a high income country, a Viksit Bharat by 2047. Next, please. I don't want to go over this in detail. I've gone over most of these, but I just wanted to mention our macroeconomic fundamentals are quite sound. Inflation is less than 6%. The RBI has been taking a lot of measures to maintain that. If you look at our public finances, they're robust. Fiscal consolidation has been taken forward in this budget. And you saw also that more than 10 lakh crores have been committed to capital expenditure. The 50-year interest-free capital grant to states has been extended, so 1.3 lakh crores there. So in many ways, this budget is looking ahead. It's not looking at the immediate. And so fairly robust public finances, strong manufacturing and exports. Despite the global downturn, which could affect some of our exports, the services is growing and markets are being diversified, and a very strong manufacturing base, particularly triggered by the production-linked incentive, the PLI program, which is really pushing global manufacturing champions in India and sunrise sectors, and trying to make us one of the global value chain hub of the world. It's also increasingly a top FDI destination. I was at the World Economic Forum in Davos last month. Tremendous interest in India. You can see how global companies want to come in for obvious reasons. Many of them want to diversify away from China. In climate again, if you look at our climate commitments, India's nationally determined contributions, NDCs, we are really walking the talk on climate. So even if you look at the commitment to reach by 2030 to have at least 50% of our electricity capacity to come from non-fossil fuels, we're already at about 42%. So we are ahead of the curve. The Prime Minister has also introduced the concept of lifestyle for the environment, which is about how individuals and communities can really walk the talk on climate, and how individually and collectively we can all act to saving the planet. So in many ways on climate, and again, all this will figure largely in the G20 presidency of India, which is ongoing, on climate, on environment, I think we are recognized as global leaders as well. Next, please. So I was talking about the G20 presidency, and I think it's important to understand how important this is for India, not just to sort of lead on many of these important topics which I'm coming to, but also to provide South-South leadership. In many ways, all our successes on sustainable development goals, on basic services, whether it's sanitation, bank accounts, water supply, housing, all that, these are a kind of lighthouse effect for the world. So the G20 presidency is quite important to try and shape the global development agenda, but also to provide support to other countries in the world. These are some of the important topics or priorities for the G20 presidency. The first and foremost is the technological transformation and the digital public infrastructure of India, which is completely unique. And again, whether you talk of building on Aadhaar or CoWIN, our vaccination program, 2 billion people in the world, but and our digital identity, data and payment through ULIP. Today in India, ULIP has completely transformed the way payments are made. All of us use, whether it's Google Pay, and 200 banks are linked. And therefore, the digital story of India, how it's gone right down from urban areas down to villages, has been phenomenal. The Prime Minister mentioned just a couple of days ago how through direct benefit transfer, building on our digital backbones, something or close to 30 lakh crores have been transferred directly into beneficiary accounts, which has completely cut out all the rent seeking and the middlemen and the corruption which used to take place 30, 40 years ago. So the digital transformation and the technology transformation is to a large extent going to drive the economy, and that's one of the major topics of the G20, and we're going to share those lessons with the world. Accelerating progress on the sustainable development goals, particularly health and education, an important agenda on the G20, and many lessons from India to share with others. Life is lifestyle for the environment, green development, whether it's electric mobility, whether it's green hydrogen. Again, recently the 20,000 crore green hydrogen mission was announced, and this is really going to push clean energy and green energy forward. Climate finance, a major issue. The northern countries have made big commitments in Paris, and India, along with other developing countries, we're going to hold these northern countries to their promises of providing more concessional finance, both for mitigation as well as adaptation. Women-led development. There's been tremendous progress on women empowerment in India, even through providing basic services, whether it's sanitation, water, bank accounts. There's been a tremendous amount of women empowerment programs. And if you remember in the Prime Minister's 15th August speech of 2022, he spoke about how women empowerment has been done and needs to continue. And he spoke about Nari Ka Samman. Then we talk of accelerated, inclusive and resilient growth. So therefore, this is something which, despite the global headwinds, as I mentioned, how we have taken forward both on the macroeconomic front, both in terms of inflation, but also in terms of growth. And if you saw how the finance minister committed to for deficit financing to keep the deficit below 6% next year, and actually bring it down even further by 25-26. And that's the role of the fiscal consolidation program. And then lastly, you'll see below is multilateral institutions for the 21st century. There's a big agenda. In fact, that's one of the areas which I will be expected to focus on in my upcoming job as India's executive director of the World Bank, is how can these institutions be reformed? Yesterday, the Prime Minister addressing the finance ministers of the G20 made it very clear that much more needs to be done by the multilateral institutions, which include the World Bank, the UN system, the Asian Development Bank, how they need to get their act going, and they need to become 21st century multilateral institutions to deal with 21st century problems and issues. And he highlighted two specific areas which they need to prioritize. One was climate action, climate financing, and the second one was related to continuing to eradicate poverty from across the globe. And of course, the focusing on the 3 Fs will be critical, not just by them, but by all these countries together. Because those are some critical areas which obviously with our import bill, fuel is critical, which is why we're trying to move away from fossil fuels. But again, it's going to take, about 30, 40 years before we finally are setting ourselves a 2070 net zero target. But what is the roadmap towards that? That's something which currently is being prepared. Next, please. Now, I thought that I would focus, one can go on and on, but I wanted to sort of keep it relatively brief. These are some key areas of importance in the Amrit Kaal, which we'll be working on as milestones as we move towards a 2047 milestone. The one key area which all of us are increasingly recognizing, sometimes taken for granted, is how through the digital revolution, through Digital India 1.0 and 2.0, increasingly we have become going paperless, cashless, presence-less, and trust-based, making it much easier for our rapidly emerging middle class. Now today we have anywhere from 400 to 500 million in the middle class because of the huge poverty reduction programs. Less than 15% of our population is now in the poverty category, and we had more than 30% at one stage. But I think in the last 8 or 9 years, the middle class, the focus on an aspirational driven India for the middle class is really driving some of these major reform agendas. Reaching the last mile, there'll still be people who are vulnerable, like tribal groups, other marginalized groups. So we need to have growth, but we need to have inclusive growth. And then, of course, we need to take everyone along, which is Sabka Saath, Sabka Prayas. Next, please. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, but it's good to sort of remind ourselves again how our very, very powerful DPI, digital public infrastructure, the India stack story. So here is how, building on 2 or 3 digital platforms. One is Aadhaar. You've got the jam trinity, right? Aadhaar, mobiles, and bank accounts. Then you've got payments through UPI, Unified Payment Interface. And then we've got our CoWIN, digital platform for vaccinations. And I keep telling people that I've lived many years in America, and I got my vaccine shots for COVID in the US. I still carry a tattered CVS paper card, whereas everyone in India has got a digital vaccination, identity. So we are much more advanced in India than they are on that front. Then, of course, we have got how you pay utilities. I mean, we take many of these things for granted, but actually all this has happened only in the last few years, whether it's taxation, online education, health, e-governance. And therefore, today, in the old days, for KYC, you had to go to a bank. But now, if you give your consent to use Aadhaar, you don't have to go anywhere. And then for people who actually want to talk to someone, you've got banking correspondents, sakhis, typically women. So even if there's no bank branch in a very remote area, you still have access to banking, either online or through a local banking correspondent, typically a woman. So the whole digital revolution now through BharatNet, every panchayat will be connected, is being connected through high-speed cable. That is now being pushed down to our 6 lakh villages. And finally, at the household level, a private operator will provide internet through Wi-Fi. So it's a public-private partnership. But the whole digital story at scale in India has really transformed in many ways the economy. Next, please. We spoke about startups. So as I mentioned, that 80,000 is now close to 90,000 startups. We have more than 100 unicorns. I'm sure many of them are in Chennai and Bangalore. These are the places which have produced the most innovations in our startups. You can see the valuation of the unicorns is more than 340 billion. And we knew this all along, whether it's Karnataka, whether it's Tamil Nadu, whether it's Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, there's a huge tech revolution going on. And I think the northern states are also catching up. And despite COVID, we saw massive investments in the tech ecosystem, which is continuing to grow very, very rapidly. So again, as we are talking of employment, because jobs obviously are key, the whole idea is to take down this ecosystem into rural, into villages. In the most recent budget, An agriculture accelerator for startups was announced. So agri-business, there's an increasing number of startups in the agri space again. So how can we take this all the way down, and how can we talk of rural youth and peri-urban youth becoming job creators rather than job seekers? And that's going to be a very important agenda in the path in Amrit Kaal towards a Viksit Bharat. Next, please. Now, again, I spoke a little bit about this. What are these more recent government initiatives in promoting emerging technologies and ecosystems? So I spoke about the Agriculture Accelerator Fund, which was announced in the recent budget speech by the finance minister. This is really looking to transform agricultural practices, increase productivity and profitability through an accelerator fund to encourage startups in the rural space and really take agriculture from kind of low value to high value, up the value chain. The green hydrogen mission, a critical part of India's sort of decarbonization strategy, 20,000 crores, 4,000 crores going to promote, to incentivize the production of electrolyzers, and the remaining for the production of hydrogen. So it's an incentive-based program. You produce and you get reimbursed. And this will really drive the greening of our economy and the whole decarbonization strategy. Of course, you need a lot of renewable energy for this, and that is already on the job. And you can see it's exploding across India, whether you look at solar or you look at wind, whether you look at hydro and even nuclear. And I was recently, on Saturday, I visited Gujarat and I went to the first fully solar powered village in India, in Madras. It's a phenomenal example of how every single one of the 1,300 households have rooftop solar. And then there's 12 hectares of 23,000 solar panels. So they are generating electricity through solar during the day. They're storing through batteries for consumption in the evening. And about 2/3 of the energy they produce is going into the grid. So they're also earning an income. So this is really the model for the future. So rooftop solar can actually, if every household in India would, you can generate income from the sun. And again, that's a big agenda going forward in Amrit Kaal, on the climate agenda, but also on the energy agenda. E-mobility, Niti has done a lot of work on this over the last several years. And again, the plan is that by 2030, hopefully there will be no internal combustion engine produced in India. And that's a massive revolution is going on in e-mobility. Today, it's mainly two-wheelers and three-wheelers, but increasingly four-wheelers moving up, and of course, buses. So the plan is to move from 5,000 buses to 50,000 buses. There's huge demand again. And so e-mobility is going to be key. Digital India I spoke about, and as well as Startup India and BharatNet already. And then again, the centers for excellence. So a big thrust in this budget on research, particularly in frontier technology areas. So whether you're looking at artificial intelligence, the pharma, we are already in many ways the pharma capital of the world, but much more needs to be done, particularly on the API front, so that we become self-reliant and Atmanirbhar, and we don't have to depend like we did in the initial part of COVID on just one country. So there's a big thrust on research. We are piggybacking on our top technological institutions. And I think this will be a major agenda in Amrit Kaal, pushing the research agenda so that we can become our centers of excellence can push us towards technological self-reliance. Next, please. And I thought I would come back to this because this is really important. Sometimes we take this for granted, but the first 5 years of the NDA government, from 14 to 19, it really focused on providing basic services, particularly in rural areas, but to the poor. And delivery was done at scale on the ground with results, with verifiable results. The Swachh Bharat mission, of course, I was personally involved with that. It was less about building toilets and more about changing behavior. 550 million people moved out of open defecation and started using toilets. It's quite difficult to get that sort of mindset change. And of course, in 2019, 2nd October, open defecation free. It's an ongoing program. There will be gaps, but those are being addressed. Then if you look at electrification. This is just one example which happened within a 1,000-day program. But today we have electricity in all our villages. Again, and solar is complementing some of the more remote areas. Jan Dhan, 400 million bank accounts opened in the first 5 years of this government, particularly of women. So again, this is something which India can contribute to the world. Today, globally, there are still 4 billion people who have no digital identity. Remember, we take our Aadhaar for granted. There are 2 billion people who don't have access to bank accounts, many in Africa, and there are more than 130 countries which still deal in cash. So huge lessons from us, and in our own country, Jan Dhan means every family's got a bank account, more or less. Jal Jeevan Mission, which is going on in full steam. This was started when I was secretary in the Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation. Look at the scale, 190 million functioning household tap connections to be built. And we're already at close to 60%. Phenomenal performance is going on at rapid speed. How can you become a developed country if you don't have tap water supply in every house? How can you become a developed country if you don't have toilets in every house which are being used? Banks. So I think Ayushman Bharat, this is the largest health insurance scheme in the world for 10 crore Indian households. How can you become a developed country if you don't have a strong safety net, so that if you have illness at home, you're not going into catastrophic expenditure to meet with those emergent health needs. So these were major programs done at scale by this government in the first 5 years. Some of them are continuing. And these programs looking at multidimensional poverty really help push up the middle class to lead to an aspirational India for better services, whether you look at infrastructure in cities, metros, air travel has mushroomed, tourism has mushroomed. So I think we have an aspirational middle class now with cash in their hands. And that is in many ways, we have a huge domestic market, which is not only attracting FDI, but also propelling, becoming a serious growth driver for our economy. Next, please. So I'm just going to, I have a couple more slides. Let's look at the highlights of this budget, which is really the first budget of the Amrit Kaal. Now, as I mentioned, world-class infrastructure is being created, whether it's highways, buildings, ports, airports, 10 lakh crores of capex allocated, which is really looking in the medium to long term. So it's not a short-term budget, and that expenditure is a 1/3 increase over the previous year. But at the same time, if you look at some of the more vulnerable segments of our population and society, how there's a targeted approach. So for the first time, the Pradhan Mantri PVTG stands for particularly vulnerable tribal groups. There are about 28 lakh of this population. It's at the bottom rung of the tribal community, which is itself, marginalized and backward in the sense of being in different parts of the country, in scattered remote parts. So 15,000 crores have been allocated to this, and this will be done in just 3 years. 28 lakh people, they'll be saturated with basic services. So that's a very important announcement made. And in NITI, we worked very closely with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs to put together this program. I had gone along with the Secretary of Tribal Affairs to visit some of the most backward areas, in fact, where the Honorable President comes from, which is Mayurbhanj and Keonjhar in Orissa. So we learned about that, and we helped Tribal Affairs to put together this program. Then if you look at the skilling program, now it's Pradhan Mantri Kaushal Vikas Yojana 4.0. Why 4.0? Because now it's looking at skills for the future. We're looking at AI. We're looking at areas which are going to be required, whether it's in pharmacy, whether it's going to be in technology. These are skills not for today, but for tomorrow. And not only that, the payment now for the stipend to be paid to our apprentices will be done through DBT. So they'll get it directly in their bank accounts. So they don't have to depend on their employers who may or may not cut some of it out of their hands. Dekho Apna Desh, this is again focusing on the services tourism sector. And again, this is another program which is going to give a huge fillip to tourism. Now, we may have only 11 million tourists visiting India, and that is going to grow post-COVID. But yesterday I was at the India Today Tourism Awards, where we found that domestic tourism is mushrooming in India. And actually, that's going to be a huge growth driver. It's also an employment creator, particularly for the youth. So whether it's an entrepreneurship through startups in the tourism sector, or whether it's jobs, Dekho Apna Desh, another major initiative, and PM Vikas for artisans. So all our blacksmiths, goldsmiths, carpenters, that's a program targeted at them. How can we promote skilling, entrepreneurship, and leadership training in these typically minority and artisan communities across the country? Another very targeted approach for communities which traditionally have been neglected. Next, please. Now, these are some of the initiatives which Niti Aayog has been championing. The first is the Aspiration Districts program, something which the Prime Minister has been repeatedly referring to, which he ideated and led 4 years ago, taking the most lagging districts in India. There were 112 identified, and they were jump-started through convergence, collaboration, competition. There's a ranking going on, and these 112 districts, more than half of them have already reached the national average. So you can imagine, typically there are, many of they're across the country, but they're more in the northern belt, in UP, in Jharkhand, in Bihar, in Madhya Pradesh, in Orissa. And now, how do you take them? Because in the end, we've got 700 districts in India. In Amrit Kaal, and for a developed India, you can't have, 1/5 of our districts which are way behind. And therefore, how do we get these towards more of the southern states where districts are much more and states are more prosperous? So this is a major program which has succeeded very well. But now the Prime Minister decided to decentralize it to another level. So now 500 blocks have been taken up. Again, some of the most lagging blocks in India. Now jump-starting blocks to the state average. And this was announced again in the Finance Minister's speech. So Niti Aayog is working with other ministries and states to push this forward. So all these are core elements of the strategy in Amrit Kaal to jumpstart and bring up these lagging blocks across the country to the state average. So as the rest of the country is progressing rapidly, the more lagging blocks and districts are also trying to keep pace. The Atal Innovation Mission in Niti, which is incubation of startups in Atal Innovation Labs. In addition to that, how do we get youngsters into tinkering and innovation? ATL is Atal Tinkering Labs, and these are across the country. They're in Tamil Nadu, they're in Kerala, they're in Karnataka, they're everywhere. 10,000 of these tinkering labs have already been created. And now the idea is over the next 5 years to scale them up to maybe close to 70,000 Atal Tinkering Labs, so that all our schools have been exposed to tinkering, to innovation, to technology, to digital. And so how our youth can jumpstart, because don't forget, 25 years from now, it's going to be the 10-year-olds and the 15-year-olds who are going to be leading, who are going to be 35, 40, 50 at that stage. And that's going to be, they are the people who are going to be leading the country in different spheres, whether it's in the government or the private sector. So I think the whole idea is how do we get our youth ready to sort of move across rapidly in Amrit Kaal towards that Viksit Bharat. NDAP, a national data analytics platform led by Niti, which brings together more than 200 databases in a public platform to improve access to Indian government's data, both rural, urban. This is a very important tool. There was an op-ed which the chief economic advisor and I put out a couple of days ago, saying how data is leading to better governance. And so this is an open platform which can be used by anyone. I'm not sure if there are any more slides, but can we go to the next, please? And finally, I think this is the last slide. So look, this is a joint endeavor. You can talk of public-private partnerships, you can talk of government and the citizens. So the PM is very clear that it's first of all, not individual ministries, but whole of government. But in our federal system, it's center and states. So it's a question of cooperative, competitive federalism. Niti Aayog has started the state support mission, again announced in the budget, where we are reaching out to all states on a tailor-made approach to see how can they focus and achieve their inclusive goals. So if India has to become a $5 trillion economy in a few years and a $30 trillion economy by 2047, it's a critical role of the states. So if UP has to become 1 trillion or Tamil Nadu has to become $1 trillion, how can we support the states in achieving that inclusive goal? And in the end, it's about all citizens and government and communities coming together. So I think this collaboration of everyone has a stake in it. And I think Sabka Prayas is going to be critical finally for the journey towards Amrit Kaal. I think that's my last slide. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parmesh Nair, for your insightful address. And we are going to have 5 minutes. I'll try and take 2-3 questions quickly for you to respond. There's so much of achievements shown by you all over. This morning, the chief guest for the inaugural session was Mr. Premachandran, Member of Parliament. He observed that that in spite of the GDP growth and become the 5th largest economy in the world and many growth benefits, which has record, I think, to showcase in the world, but it's not really inclusive, not reached the common man at the right bottom. Still, many are still suffering. What's your views on this, and how do you think the future moving forward initiative which should be implemented by the government to cover an inclusive growth and cover the entire segment of the population in all-round development of what you have been achieving so far?
Sure, Vijay, I have to sort of respectfully disagree with the Honorable Member of Parliament because, as I mentioned in my presentation, the focus, inclusive growth has been the top priority of this government. If you look at the programs which have delivered at scale but on the ground, whether it's, targeted women and girls benefiting from toilets in their houses instead of having to go out in the dark. And for 70 years, the increase in sanitation coverage was only 30%, 35% over 70 years. And then in just 5 years, it went from that to close to 100. So that's just one example. Jal Jeevan Mission, women and girls no longer have to walk long distances to fetch water. Bank accounts, 400 million. Now the tribal focus. So this government has focused tremendously on the most vulnerable. And unlike previous governments, when a previous Prime Minister famously said that only 15 paisa of every rupee reaches the beneficiary. And here it's going through direct benefit transfer. So there are many challenges ahead, no question about that. But the focused effort on delivery of basic services to the vulnerable at scale, I think is unmatched. That's one part. And then, of course, there's the growth part, right? Of course, look, we are the fastest growing large economy, 5th largest economy in the world. I think there's been a concerted effect on the macroeconomic front to stabilize the economy. Globally, there are many challenges. It's not going to be easy, but I think we have put ourselves on a sound footing to manage the next couple of years well, and then move into a kind of takeoff phase. So I think that's my response to that. But of course, it's open to opinion.
Yes, another question from one of our members is, how can we ensure that the skills and competencies of Indian workforce are aligned with the needs of the rapidly evolving economy? What is the yes?
It's a very good question, right? And the whole skill development program, which has been going on for the last 7 or 8 years, has now reached, I think, a takeoff point, because now the ecosystem has been tremendously strengthened. Now, urban, rural, the key thing, of course, is to the collaboration with industry, right? And that's now being put on a firm footing. Unless industry is closely involved, and the whole skilling program is not demand-based, because in the end, industry is going to, private sector is going to employ the skilled youth in particular. And in this budget, you saw now skilling 4.0. So we're also looking ahead. We're looking at the present, but we're looking ahead. What are the skills which are going to be required in the future? What are the skills which are going to be required for the world? Now, today, there's a huge demand for medical tourism in India, but globally, as the global population is living longer, in India, we live globally, there's a huge requirement for the care economy globally. So whether it's nurses from India or providing medical services both in India and abroad, that's a critical area of skilling again. So I think it's important to respond to the demand from industry, but also globally.
You implemented successfully the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and which is really very well known around, not only around India, around the world. When you look back, you can recall what you could have done some little better, that Swachh Bharat Abhiyan could have been much more implemented to be a showcase project of the India around the world.
Yeah, look, hindsight is always 2020. So I'm trying to look back. I'm sure there were lots of things we could have done. I think one of the things we started focusing partly on the first challenge was how do you scale up access to sanitation? How do you change behavior? And we focused on that in two ways, through mass media, but we had at least one village motivator in every village. We call them Swachhagrahis. So I think the training, the retraining of Swachhagrahis to sustain behavior change. We could have started earlier. So for example, the behavior was changed, but sustaining change behavior is very challenging, right? Because there could be a tendency to go back to the old habit. So we started the sustainability, the sustaining the change behavior, about a year and a half before the program, in the first phase of the program. But I think we should have started a bit earlier. So what is the capacity of the village motivators? How do you retrain them? What are the incentives and mechanisms to sustain change behavior? In retrospect, we could have started a little earlier. That was one thing I would have changed. The second also was the need to change the behavior also of government officials, at all levels, whether it's in the center or the state or the district. We were focusing on directly of the beneficiaries. How do you change behavior moving from open defecation to using toilets at home? So that was critical because they were the targeted 550 million people. We started change, but there were still many skeptics. So it was important for everyone to understand what are the economic benefits of sanitation. If you invest in sanitation, there's a health return, there's an environmental return. So I think that also we could have started in the beginning, but we had to focus more on getting people out of open defecation. But I think we soon realized that you also need to change the behavior of government officials, of panchayats, etc. Those were a couple of things. I'm sure there are many more, but these are the two I can think of.
Thank you, Mr. Iyer. One last question before we let you go is, you are moving to the World Bank, Executive Director representing India. Now, there are two Indians at the head of World Bank. So what's your view? Do you think the Indian clout in the World Bank will do a lot of good to India, or what's your passing thoughts on this?
No, absolutely. We are all very excited. Ajay Banga was a year junior to me in college. I'm also a professor of management practice at IIM Ahmedabad. Hopefully that nomination process will get confirmed. One of the roles of the executive board to which I've been nominated is actually to confirm the selection of the nominee. Now, again, but this process is still right now open. He's the nominee of the US government. There could be other nominees. And, we'll see how this process unfolds. But it's an exciting time for me to go back to Washington to represent India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Sri Lanka on the executive board. And given the window of opportunity for India, it's a sweet spot for India and the world. The Prime Minister's standing, globally our role as a sort of global player, increasingly of importance both economically and politically. So I think India's clout is quite high, and hopefully the World Bank, will respond to those, the demands of all developing countries. But I think India can play an important role in shaping that global development agenda at the World Bank.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Parmesh Nair, for sharing your insights, thought-provoking. We wish you all the very best in your new endeavor as Executive Director of the World Bank. Thank you so much. And please join me in conveying our sincere appreciation, Mr. Iyer, for sharing his thing in spite of his busy commitment. You are separated by distance, you are here, you are allowed to think, and since you are separated by the distance, as a token of your appreciation, this is what we do. We do a lot of CSR work at many schools. What we want to do it on your behalf, we would like to feed couple of hundreds of children who are very poor children in the school, so that it'll only add, because of people like you come and speak at MMA, it's inspired to do a lot of many things. Thank you so much. And once again, very, all the very best in your endeavor at the World Bank at Washington. And I'm quite sure when you're going to be there, we're going to request you again. We will speak to the members of MMA on another important subject on another important occasion. Thank you. Bye-bye till we meet again.
Thank you so much, Vijay. And thanks for feeding the kids, and look forward to being in touch, Vijay. Good to see you again. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this session. Please await for the next session, which will be commencing in a few seconds.